In the spring of 1350, when William Cooper walked out to plough the common fields of Ashbrook Village, he counted only 7 other men where there should have been 30, and he knew that everything about the life his ancestors had lived for 500 years was about to change forever. The Black Death had arrived in Ashbrook in the autumn of 1348, carried by a traveling merchant from Bristol who'd stopped at the village inn complaining of fever and painful swellings in his neck and groin. Within a week he was dead. Within a month half the village was dead. By the time the plague exhausted itself and moved on to other communities in the spring of 1349, Ashbrook's population had been reduced from approximately 120 souls to fewer than 40. This was not unusual. Across England, across Europe, across much of the known world, the Great Mortality, as people would come to call it, had killed between 1/3 and half of all living humans in just 3 years. Entire villages were abandoned. Cities lost half their populations. The social, economic, and agricultural systems that had governed life for centuries collapsed under the weight of so many dead. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. For survivors like William Cooper, the plague's end brought not relief but a different kind of crisis. The dead had to be buried, but there were barely enough living to dig the graves. Fields that had been cultivated for generations lay empty because there weren't enough hands to work them. Animals wandered unfenced and unclaimed because their owners were dead. The entire structure of feudal agricultural life, based on large populations of peasant laborers working the lord's lands and their own strips in the common fields, had been shattered. William stood in the morning cold of that spring day in 1350, looking at the vast expanse of the common fields that surrounded Ashbrook. These fields had been the center of village life since before anyone could remember, certainly since before the Norman conquest 300 years earlier, probably for centuries before that. They were organized in the ancient system that governed most English agriculture. 3 great fields, each divided into strips, with each family holding multiple strips scattered throughout the fields. This system had evolved over centuries to distribute both good and poor land fairly among the villagers. No family got all their strips in the best soil or all in the worst. Everyone had some strips on the fertile bottomland near the stream, some on the middling soil of the gentle slopes, some on the thinner soil of the hilltops. This ensured that a bad year on one part of the field wouldn't ruin any single family, and it forced cooperation since everyone's strips were intermixed with everyone else's. But the system required substantial labor. Each strip needed to be plowed, planted, weeded, and harvested. The 3-field system meant that one field was always fallow, recovering its fertility, while the other 2 were planted with winter wheat and spring crops respectively. Managing this rotation, coordinating the village's work so that everyone plowed together, planted together, and harvested together, required organization and cooperation that depended on having enough people to do the work. Now, looking at those fields, William saw a different reality. Where 30 families had once held strips, now only 7 remained with able-bodied men to work them. The strips that had belonged to the dead lay empty, their boundaries marked by stone markers and wooden stakes, but their soil unworked. Some strips were being reclaimed by weeds and grass, reverting to the wild with shocking speed. William himself had held 4 strips before the plague, scattered across the 3 fields as tradition dictated. Now, with his father and elder brother dead, he was the only surviving male in his family, responsible not only for his own strips, but for maintaining his family's position in the village hierarchy. And he faced an impossible question. How could he possibly work 4 strips when there were barely enough men to work even half the strips that needed attention? The other men gathering in the field that morning faced similar calculations. John Miller had lost his wife and 3 children, but survived along with his elderly father, who was too frail to do heavy field work. Robert Thatcher had lost everyone, wife, children, parents, siblings, and was now alone in a cottage that had once held 7 people. Thomas Shepherd had survived with his wife and 2 sons, making his family the largest intact unit remaining in Ashbrook. Peter Smith, the village blacksmith, had lost his wife, but his 3 adult sons had survived, giving him more labor than most. The lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey de Ashbrook, had survived the plague. Though his wife and 2 of his 3 children had died, he still held authority over the village and its lands, but that authority was complicated by the new reality of scarce labor. Before the plague, Sir Geoffrey had been able to demand work from his villagers, requiring them to plough his domain lands, the portion of the manor he controlled directly, before they could work their own strips, commanding their labor for road repair and ditch digging and whatever other tasks he deemed necessary. But now, with so few laborers remaining, Sir Geoffrey's ability to command was constrained by simple arithmetic. If he demanded too much labor for his own lands, the villagers' strips wouldn't be worked, and they would starve. If the villagers starved or fled to seek better conditions elsewhere, Sir Geoffrey would have no one to work any of the land. The balance of power, built on centuries of feudal custom and law, was shifting. William walked along the boundaries of his strips, checking the markers, seeing how the land had changed even in just one planting season of neglect. Thistles and dock were already establishing themselves. The drainage ditches that every holder was responsible for maintaining on their strips had partially filled with silt and debris. The land was unruined. 1 year of neglect couldn't undo centuries of cultivation, but another year or 2 and these strips would be difficult to reclaim. He bent and picked up a handful of soil, crumbling it between his fingers. Good earth, dark and rich, from centuries of manure and careful management. His family had worked these particular strips for as long as anyone could remember, generation after generation, maintaining them, improving them incrementally, passing down not just the land itself, but the intimate knowledge of its peculiarities. Which corner tended to stay wet, where the soil was stonier, which edge grew the best wheat. All that accumulated knowledge suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the absence of people to carry it forward. William's father should have been the one teaching him the final details of managing these strips, the subtle wisdom that couldn't be written down, but had to be learned through years of observation. His brother should have been working alongside him, sharing the labor and the knowledge. Instead, William was alone with partial knowledge and too much work. The other men were gathering near the great oak that stood at the corner, where the 3 fields met a tree so old that people said it had been there before the village, that perhaps the village had been built around it. This oak was where the village held its open-air meetings, where disputes were settled and decisions made. The reeve, the villager elected to coordinate the common fieldwork and interface with the Lord, would normally have been the one to call them together, but the reeve had died of plague. No replacement had yet been chosen, perhaps because no one wanted the responsibility of managing the chaos they now faced. Thomas Shepherd, by virtue of being the eldest surviving man and having the largest intact family, had taken on an informal leadership role. He stood beneath the oak now, waiting as the men assembled. When everyone who was coming had arrived, just 7 men, plus Peter Smith's 3 sons, making 10 in total, Thomas began to speak. "We all know why we're here," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning air. "We need to decide what to do about the fields. We don't have enough men to work all the strips that need working. We need to figure out priorities, and we need to figure out what to tell Sir Geoffrey about working his domain." Robert Thatcher, the man who'd lost everyone, spoke up. "I can barely manage my own strips alone. I don't have time to work on the Lord's domain like we used to. If Sir Geoffrey demands the same labor as before, I'll have to abandon some of my own land." "We'll all have to abandon some land," John Miller said. "There's no way around it. The question is which land, and how do we decide fairly?" Peter Smith, the blacksmith, offered a practical perspective. "Some of the strips are more valuable than others. The ones near the stream with good soil and easy access to water. Those should be the priority. The strips on the hilltops, with thin soil and exposed to wind. Maybe we let those go for now. We can always reclaim them later if our population recovers." "That's easy for you to say," William heard himself saying. "You're a smith. Your living doesn't depend entirely on your strips. But some of us need every bit of land we can work to feed our families." Peter nodded acknowledgement of this point. "True enough. But that doesn't change the arithmetic. There aren't enough of us. Something has to give. Thomas raised his hand for quiet. We need to think about this systematically. First question, how many strips can we actually work well with the labor we have? Be honest. No one benefits if we take on more than we can handle and end up with everything half done. The men discussed, argued, calculated. The consensus that emerged was sobering. With 10 able-bodied men and boys, they could probably work about 15 to 20 strips well, perhaps 25 if they pushed themselves and had good weather, and no one got sick or injured. Before the plague, the village had been working 60 strips. So we abandoned 40 strips, Robert said flatly. Just like that. Centuries of work, gone. Not gone, Thomas corrected. Left fallow, waiting. If people come back, if children are born, if we can recruit new families to the village, we can bring those strips back into cultivation. But for now, yes, we work maybe a third of what we used to work. The second question was harder. Which strips? Everyone wanted their best land worked. No one wanted to abandon the strips their families had held for generations. The discussions grew heated, with men arguing about whose claims were stronger, whose needs were greater, whose land was more productive. Finally, William proposed a solution. What if we temporarily set aside the old assignments? What if we work the best land collectively, pool our labor and divide the harvest according to need and contribution, just until we're back on our feet? The suggestion was met with stunned silence. What William was proposing was radical, almost heretical. The strip system, with each family holding specific strips in perpetuity, was foundational to village life. It determined status, inheritance, identity itself. Families defined themselves by their strips. The Cooper family had worked the same 4 strips for 8 generations that anyone could document, probably longer. To abandon that system, even temporarily, was to abandon tradition itself. But Thomas was nodding slowly. It might work, not forever, but for a season or two. We work the best 15 strips together, whoever's strips they used to be. We coordinate the labor like we always have, but we do it as a group rather than each man working his own strips separately. And we divide the harvest fairly. The families with more mouths to feed get more, but everyone who works gets a share. Sir Geoffrey will never allow it, John Miller said. He'll insist on the old system, on his traditional rights. Sir Geoffrey needs us more than we need him right now, Peter Smith observed. If we all walk away, seek positions in other manors that are desperate for labor, he's left with nothing. He'll negotiate if we present a united front. This was another radical idea. For centuries, villagers had been tied to their land by law and custom. They were serfs, unfree peasants who couldn't leave without the Lord's permission. But the plague had changed that calculation. With labor suddenly scarce, lords couldn't afford to be too strict about keeping unhappy workers. Villages and manors were competing for laborers, offering better terms, relaxing traditional requirements. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone knew it, even if no one wanted to say it directly. The meeting under the oak tree continued for hours, with the men debating, arguing, eventually reaching a provisional agreement. They would work 15 strips collectively this season, choosing the best land regardless of whose family had traditionally held it. They would offer to work Sir Geoffrey's domain for a specified number of days, fewer than tradition demanded but more than they'd owe if they simply walked away, and they would divide the harvest based on a formula that considered both family size and labor contributed. It was Thomas who would carry this proposal to Sir Geoffrey. As the informal leader and a man known for speaking carefully, he was the best choice. The meeting broke up with plans to reconvene in 2 days after Thomas had spoken with the Lord. William walked back toward his cottage, his mind churning. Everything was changing, and he wasn't sure whether to feel excited or terrified. The old certainties, the traditional ways that had governed his ancestors' lives for generations, were dissolving. In their place was uncertainty, negotiation, possibility, and danger. His mother, Alice Cooper, was waiting when he returned. She was 43 years old, which made her ancient by the standards of the time, having survived not only the plague, but decades of hard agricultural life. She'd lost her husband and eldest son to the plague, but she'd survived along with William and William's younger sister Emma, who was 14. "What was decided?" Alice asked as William entered the cottage. He explained the provisional plan, watching his mother's face as he described abandoning the traditional strip assignments in favor of collective work on the best land. He expected resistance, attachment to the old ways, perhaps anger at the suggestion of giving up strips the Cooper family had held for generations. But instead, Alice nodded slowly. "It's practical. We'll survive. And that's what matters. Tradition is all well and good, but you can't eat tradition. And there's no point maintaining claims to strips we can't work. You're not upset about giving up our strips?" "Giving up?" Alice looked at him sharply. "We're not giving up anything, William. We're adapting. When the situation changes, we'll adapt again. The Cooper family will still be here, and we'll still be farming, and that's what matters. The specific strips are less important than the family's continuation." It was a pragmatic attitude, typical of Alice, who'd always been the practical one in the family. William's father had been more traditional, more attached to the old ways. But his father was dead, and it was his mother's practicality that would guide them now. 2 days later, Thomas reported back. Sir Geoffrey had been surprisingly amenable to the proposed arrangement, though he'd negotiated for slightly more labor on his domain than they'd initially offered. But he'd agreed to the collective working of the common field strips, and had even suggested that the manor would provide seed grain from his stores for the spring planting, understanding that many families' seed supplies had been depleted or lost during the chaos of the plague year. The bargain was struck, and the real work began. The 10 men and boys gathered in the south field, the one designated for spring planting this year, and began the enormous task of preparing the chosen 15 strips for plowing. The strips that were being worked were scattered across the field, some of the best bottomland, some middling strips on gentle slopes, chosen for their soil quality and manageability rather than for whose family had traditionally held them. The first task was clearing the winter's accumulation of dead vegetation and debris. Even strips that had been planted the previous year needed this clearing, and the strips that had lain fallow were worse. They worked together, moving from strip to strip, a practice called common work that had always been part of village life, but which now took on new significance. In the old days, common work had been supplemental to the primary work each man did on his own strips. Now common work was all there was. William found himself working alongside men he'd known his entire life, but hadn't often labored beside. The strip system had kept men somewhat isolated, each focused on their own land. Now they were truly working collectively, and the social dynamics were different. They talked as they worked, sharing observations about the soil, debating the best techniques for managing particular challenges, telling stories. Robert Thatcher, working beside William, spoke about his loss for the first time since the plague had ended. "I still set the table for 5, he said quietly. "Every evening I put out 5 bowls, 5 spoons. It takes me a moment each time to remember they're not coming home." William didn't know what to say to that. How do you respond to such grief? In the end, he said simply, "I'm sorry," inadequate words for an incomprehensible loss. "The work helps," Robert continued. "Keeping busy, staying focused on what needs to be done. If I stop moving, if I have too much time to think, it becomes overwhelming." Others nodded. They all understood. Grief was universal in the spring of 1350, and work was one of the few things that made it bearable. The plowing began on a bright April morning. Plowing was traditionally done with teams of oxen pulling heavy wooden plows that cut furrows in the soil. Before the plague, the village had owned 8 plow teams collectively, with families taking turns using them according to a complex schedule that ensured fair access. Now only 3 plow teams remained, some of the oxen having died during the plague year due to neglect when their owners fell sick and couldn't care for them. The remaining oxen were pooled, and the men took turns plowing, one guiding the plow while another led the oxen, and others following behind to break up large clods and clear stones. It was back-breaking work, but there was a rhythm to it, a satisfaction in seeing the brown earth turn over, in smelling the rich, damp soil, in watching the straight furrows extend across the strips. William took his turn behind the plow, gripping the handles, feeling the tool buck and jump as it encountered rocks and roots, fighting to keep the furrow straight. His father had made it look easy, but William was discovering how much strength and skill it required. By the end of his first hour, his shoulders ached and his hands were blistered, but he was starting to understand the technique, the way you had to read the soil and adjust to its resistance. Thomas worked nearby, guiding a second plow, and he called out encouragement and corrections. "Don't fight it so much, William. Let the plow do the work. Your job is to guide, not to force." William adjusted his approach, and Thomas was right. It did become slightly easier when he stopped trying to muscle the plow through the soil, and instead focused on keeping it oriented correctly. They plowed for weeks, working strip by strip, turning over the soil in preparation for planting. The weather was cooperative, a string of clear days that allowed the work to proceed without interruption. This was fortunate. With their reduced numbers, they couldn't afford delays. Between the plowing sessions, there were countless other tasks. The drainage ditches that ran alongside each strip needed to be cleaned out, a job that was tedious but essential for preventing waterlogging. The boundaries between strips needed to be maintained, the stones and stakes that marked them checked and replaced where they'd been disturbed. The hedgerows that bordered the common fields needed trimming to prevent them from encroaching on the cultivated land. And there was the Lord's domain to work. Sir Geoffrey's lands required the same attention as the common strips, and the villagers had agreed to provide labor for this work. It was a delicate negotiation. They needed to fulfill their obligations to avoid conflict with the Lord, but they also needed to prioritize the common strips that would actually feed their families. They worked the domain on Mondays and Thursdays, giving those days to Sir Geoffrey and keeping the other days for the common strips. This was fewer days than tradition demanded, but Sir Geoffrey had agreed to it, understanding that the alternative might be losing his laborers entirely to other manors that were offering better terms. As spring advanced towards summer, the planting began. Barley and oats were sown in the spring planting field, scattered by hand in a practiced motion that William's father had taught him as a child. The seeds were precious, each one representing potential food for the coming winter, and they were sown carefully to maximize germination while avoiding waste. Behind the sowers came others dragging brush harrows to cover the seeds with soil, protecting them from birds. Children, including Emma, William's sister, were deployed to watch the fields and scare away crows and other birds that might eat the newly planted seeds. This was traditional children's work, and Emma took it seriously, spending long days in the fields with a clapper to make noise whenever birds approached. The winter wheat, planted the previous autumn, was already growing in the west field, showing green shoots that were advancing toward maturity. This wheat had been planted before the plague struck, by men who were now dead, and there was something poignant about tending crops that dead hands had planted. William found himself thinking often about continuity and change. The wheat growing in the west field connected this season to the last, connected the living to the dead. His father had probably planted some of those seeds, and now William was preparing to harvest what his father had sown. It was a tangible link across death, a reminder that agricultural life was always about planning for future seasons, about work that spanned generations. But at the same time, everything was changing. The old strip system was suspended, perhaps permanently. The balance of power between lord and laborers was shifting. The certainties that had governed village life for centuries were dissolving, and no one knew what would replace them. In May, word reached Ashbrook about changes happening in other manors and villages. Some places had been completely abandoned, their populations killed or fled, their fields reverting to wilderness. Other places were seeing radical experiments with labor arrangements, with lords offering wages for work that had previously been compulsory, with customary obligations being negotiated and reduced, with serfs being allowed to buy their freedom. There was talk of a labor shortage driving wages up across England. Workers could demand better terms, could move to places offering better conditions, could refuse obligations that had previously been inescapable. The legal framework of feudalism was still intact, but the practical reality was evolving rapidly. Sir Geoffrey called a meeting of all the villagers in late May, held in front of the manor house rather than under the traditional oak. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by decades of managing the estate, now alone except for his surviving son, who was being educated at a monastery and wouldn't return for several years. The plague had taken his wife and his younger children, and he looked diminished by the losses, less authoritative than he'd been. "I've been hearing reports from other manors," Sir Geoffrey began. "Many are struggling worse than we are. Some lords have lost so many peasants they're considering merging holdings or abandoning less productive lands entirely. I want you all to know that I consider us fortunate to have the workers we still have, and I'm committed to making arrangements that allow us all to survive and eventually prosper again." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm prepared to formalize some of the temporary arrangements we've been operating under. The collective working of the best common strips can continue. I'll reduce the customary labor obligations on my domain from 3 days per week to 2 days per week. And I'm willing to convert some labor obligations to rent payments for families that would prefer that arrangement." This was extraordinary. Sir Geoffrey was essentially rewriting the feudal contract, acknowledging that the old terms were no longer sustainable. The villagers listened with cautious interest, waiting to hear what he'd want in return for these concessions. "In exchange," Sir Geoffrey continued, "I need your commitment to stay at Ashbrook and to help me maintain the manor. I know there are other places offering better terms, trying to lure workers away. I can't match some of those offers. My resources are limited, but I can promise fair treatment, reasonable obligations, and a willingness to negotiate as circumstances evolve. I'm asking for loyalty, and I'm offering fairness in return." Thomas, speaking for the villagers, responded carefully. "We appreciate your willingness to adapt, Sir Geoffrey. Most of us have roots here going back generations. We'd prefer to stay if we can reach reasonable terms. Your proposals sound acceptable, though we'd want them documented formally, not just verbal agreements." Sir Geoffrey nodded. "I'll have a clerk draw up a charter documenting the new arrangements. You'll each have a chance to review it, or have someone who can review it for you before we finalize anything." This was another extraordinary development. Customary obligations were traditionally unwritten, based on collective memory and precedent. Having them documented in a charter gave the villagers leverage, made the terms enforceable beyond just Sir Geoffrey's word. It was a recognition that the power dynamic had shifted. The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. They were negotiating their way through an unprecedented crisis, finding new arrangements that might allow them to survive and rebuild. It wasn't the traditional world their ancestors had known, but perhaps it would be better, more flexible, more fair. The summer work began in earnest. The spring-planted crops needed constant attention, weeding, checking for pests, managing water during dry spells. The winter wheat ripened and was harvested in late June, a communal effort that involved everyone in the village, even the elderly and the very young who could help with gleaning and binding sheaves. The harvest was decent, though not abundant. The reduced acreage under cultivation meant less total production, but with fewer mouths to feed, there would be enough to see everyone through the winter with some surplus to sell or store against future need. The wheat was threshed, winnowed, and divided according to the formula they'd agreed upon, with adjustments for families that had contributed more labor or had more children to feed. William's family received their share, several bushels of wheat and barley that would be ground into flour for bread and porridge through the winter. It was enough, and William felt a deep satisfaction in having helped produce it. This was the first harvest he'd participated in as an adult head of household, and seeing the grain sacks in his family's cottage felt like an accomplishment. But the real test would be next year and the years after. Could they maintain this level of production? Would more people die or move away, further reducing their labor force? Would children be born to eventually replace some of the lost workers? Would families from other places move to Ashbrook, attracted by the reasonable terms Sir Geoffrey was offering? All of this was uncertain, but for now they had food and they had a plan. It was enough. As summer faded toward autumn, the rhythms of agricultural life continued. The spring-planted crops were harvested in August and September. Hay was cut from the meadows and stored for winter animal fodder. Autumn plowing began in the field that would lie fallow this year, turning over the soil to weather through winter and recover its fertility for next year's planting. And slowly, subtly, the village social structure was evolving. The collective work arrangement had broken down some of the traditional separations between families. Men who'd previously worked their own strips in relative isolation now labored side by side daily, developing closer relationships. Decisions about fieldwork were made more democratically, with all the workers having input rather than following the reeve's dictates. This was partly necessity. With so few people, everyone's contribution mattered, and it was harder to maintain strict hierarchies, but it was also reflecting a broader shift in consciousness. Having survived the plague, having seen traditional certainties shattered, people were less willing to simply accept authority without question. They were negotiating, demanding explanations, insisting on fair treatment. Sir Geoffrey, to his credit, mostly adapted to this new reality. He consulted with the villagers more than previous lords would have, explained his decisions, negotiated rather than simply commanded. Perhaps this was pragmatism, recognizing that without willing cooperation, he had no way to enforce his will. But it also seemed to reflect a genuine shift in his thinking, a recognition that the old feudal relationships were no longer sustainable. In October, a wandering friar arrived in Ashbrook, one of many itinerant religious figures who traveled through the countryside preaching and hearing confessions. He carried news from other regions and from the larger world beyond the village's immediate horizons. The friar spoke of radical religious movements emerging in response to the plague. Some people believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins and were organizing processions of flagellants who whipped themselves in penance. Others saw the plague as proof that the end times were approaching and were abandoning worldly concerns to prepare for judgment. Still others had lost faith entirely, concluding that a God who could allow such suffering was not worth worshipping. He spoke of social upheaval in cities, where labor shortages were even more acute than in rural areas. Guilds were fighting to maintain control over trade, while workers demanded higher wages. Some cities were seeing riots as lower classes demanded better treatment. The traditional social order was under strain everywhere, and he spoke of the long-term consequences people were predicting. Some scholars thought the population might never recover to pre-plague levels. Others believed that the reduced population would eventually lead to higher standards of living for survivors, since there would be more resources per person. There were debates about whether the plague would return in future years, creating recurring crises, or whether it had been a one-time disaster. Everything is uncertain, the friar concluded. The world we knew has ended. What comes next, only God knows. That night, gathered around the fire in his cottage, William discussed the friar's words with his mother and sister. Emma, now 15, had matured quickly during the crisis, taking on adult responsibilities and developing opinions she wasn't shy about expressing. "I don't think God caused the plague," Emma said firmly. "Why would God kill so many children, so many good people? It doesn't make sense as punishment." Alice looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Such open questioning of divine purposes was dangerous, potentially heretical. But these were strange times, and many people were asking similar questions. "Whatever caused it," Alice said carefully, "we have to deal with the consequences, and maybe some of those consequences will be positive. We're negotiating better terms with Sir Geoffrey. We're working together more cooperatively. Maybe the world that emerges from this crisis will be better in some ways than the world we lost." William thought about this. It was true that some aspects of their new arrangements seemed better than the old ways. The collective working of the fields was more efficient than the scattered strip system had been. The ability to negotiate terms with the Lord, rather than simply accepting whatever obligations tradition dictated, gave them more control over their lives. The closer cooperation among the surviving villagers created stronger social bonds, but it had come at such a terrible cost. William would give anything to have his father and brother back, to return to the certainty of the traditional ways, even with all their limitations. Yet he couldn't change what had happened. He could only move forward, adapt, try to build something livable from the ruins. Autumn turned to winter, and the village settled into the quieter rhythms of the cold season. the field work was largely done, aside from necessary maintenance and the care of the animals. This was the season for indoor work, repairing tools, making clothing, processing the harvested crops into storable forms. The winter of 1350-1351 was the first test of whether the new arrangements would actually sustain them. They'd harvested less than in pre-plague years, but they had fewer mouths to feed. The question was whether the ratios worked out, whether they'd have enough food to last until spring planting and the next harvest. William spent much of the winter helping his mother and sister with the endless work of maintaining a household. They ground grain into flour, baked bread, repaired clothing, spun wool into thread for new garments. The cottage that had once housed 5 people now felt empty with just 3, but the work required to maintain it was nearly the same. In January, a marriage was celebrated in the village, the first since before the plague. Robert Thatcher, the man who'd lost his entire family, married a widow from a neighboring village who'd lost her husband and was looking for security. It was a practical arrangement more than a romantic one, but it represented hope, an investment in future rather than just mourning past. The wedding feast was modest. Resources were too limited for elaborate celebration, but it felt significant. The village was beginning to rebuild, to think about future generations, to plan beyond just immediate survival. By February, it was becoming clear that they would make it through the winter with food to spare. The reduced population meant that their harvests, though smaller than before, were adequate. This was simultaneously reassuring and troubling. It meant survival was possible, but it also meant that the plague had solved the problem of overpopulation that had been building in England before 1348. There had been too many people for the available land, and wages had been depressed, and periodic famines had occurred when harvests fell short. Now there was plenty of land and not enough people, and wages were rising, and food was adequate even after a difficult harvest. It was a grim calculus, purchasing improved conditions for survivors through the deaths of millions. No one said this explicitly, but everyone understood it. Spring returned in 1351, and with it came the question of what to plant and how to organize the work. The collective system they'd developed the previous year had worked well enough, but it had been explicitly temporary. Did they want to continue it or return to something closer to the traditional strip system? A meeting was called and the debate was intense. Some men wanted to return to traditional ways to reclaim their family strips and work them individually as their ancestors had done. Others argued for continuing the collective approach, which they felt was more efficient and fostered better cooperation. Thomas proposed a compromise. They would maintain the collective working of the best land for common benefit, but families would also be assigned specific strips for their own exclusive use, smaller than the traditional holdings but genuinely theirs to manage as they saw fit. This would provide both the efficiency of collective work on key lands and the satisfaction of having family-specific holdings. After much debate, this compromise was accepted. Each family was assigned 2 strips of good land for their exclusive use, and another 10 strips were designated as collectively worked land, with the harvest from those strips distributed according to need and labor contribution. The 1351 planting season proceeded smoothly, with everyone now experienced in the new arrangements and confident about their viability. The weather was good, the crops grew well, and the harvest that autumn was actually better than the previous years, as they'd become more efficient in their working methods. More significantly, 2 new families arrived in the village that summer. Having heard that Ashbrook was offering fair terms and had good land available. One was a family from a nearby village that had been completely depopulated, the survivors scattering to seek new situations. The other was a young couple who'd been living in a town but wanted to try their hand at farming, attracted by stories of available land and opportunity in rural areas. Sir Geoffrey negotiated terms with these new arrivals, offering them strips to work and incorporating them into the village's labor arrangements. The population was slowly growing again, and with it came renewed hope for the future. Over the following years, this pattern continued. The village stabilized at a new equilibrium, with around 50 or 60 people, larger than the immediate post-plague population but still less than half the pre-plague size. The collective working arrangements became permanent, formalized in the charter Sir Geoffrey had promised. Labor obligations to the Lord were reduced and clearly specified. Some customary services were converted to money rents, giving families more flexibility in how they fulfilled their obligations. The broader social changes hinted at in the immediate aftermath of the plague accelerated over the following decades. The labor shortage gave workers unprecedented bargaining power. Wages rose dramatically, tripling or even quadrupling compared to pre-plague levels. Lords tried to enforce wage caps and restrict worker mobility, but these efforts were only partially successful. The old feudal system, based on bound labor and customary obligations, gradually gave way to a more market-based system of wage labor and voluntary agreements. This transformation wasn't smooth or linear. There were periodic attempts to restore the old order, most notably the Statute of Labourers passed by Parliament in 1351, which tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker movement. But these laws were difficult to enforce when labor was scarce, and workers could simply move to areas with better terms. The tension between lords trying to maintain traditional privileges and workers demanding better conditions eventually contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a widespread uprising that, though ultimately suppressed, demonstrated how fundamentally the balance of power had shifted. For the people of Ashbrook, these broader historical currents were experienced as gradual changes in daily life. William Cooper, who'd been 22 when the plague struck, was in his 40s by the time the social transformations were fully established. He'd married, had children who would grow up in a world very different from the one he'd been born into. His children would never know serfdom in the full traditional sense. They would negotiate terms with lords, demand fair wages, move between villages seeking better opportunities, things William's father could never have imagined doing. Emma, William's sister, married Peter Smith's youngest son and remained in Ashbrook, raising her children in the village where she'd been born. The Smith family, having survived the plague with several adult males intact, became increasingly prominent in village affairs, and Emma's marriage into the family secured the Cooper family's position as well. Alice Cooper lived into her 60s, an extraordinary age for the time, and saw her grandchildren born into a world she barely recognized. The changes that had begun with the plague had continued and accelerated, transforming not just agricultural practices but the entire social order. On her deathbed, Alice called William to her side. "I've seen so much change," she said, her voice weak but clear. "More change than I ever imagined possible. The world you're leaving to your children is nothing like the world I was born into." "Is that good or bad?" William asked. "Both," Alice said. "We lost so much, people we loved, traditions that gave life meaning and structure, but we gained things too. More freedom, more opportunity to shape our own lives. Your children won't be bound to the land the way my grandparents were. They'll have choices. That's worth something." She paused, gathering strength. "Remember the common fields, William. Remember how we learned to work together after the plague, how we adapted and survived. That's the real lesson. Not the specific arrangements we made, but the fact that we made them, that we negotiated and compromised and found new ways to live. That's what humans do. We adapt, we survive. We build new worlds from the ruins of old ones." Alice died that night, peacefully, surrounded by family. Her funeral was well attended, with the entire village turning out to honor a woman who'd lived through extraordinary times and had helped guide them through the transitions. William stood at her graveside, looking at the faces of the villagers. Some he'd known all his life, others who'd arrived after the plague, all of them bound together by shared experience and shared labor. The village had survived. The fields continued to produce food. Life went on. The common fields themselves had changed. The strict strip system of William's youth was gone, replaced by a more flexible arrangement of collective lands and family holdings. Some of the marginal lands that had been cultivated before the plague had been allowed to revert to pasture or woodland, recognized as not worth the labor required to maintain them. But the essential pattern remained. 3 great fields surrounding the village, 1 fallow and 2 planted in rotation, worked by families who'd committed themselves to this place and this community. The fields connected them to their ancestors who'd worked this same land for generations, and to descendants who would work it in the future. William was an old man now, his hair gray, his back bent from decades of field work. He had grandchildren who would carry on after him, who would farm these lands and maintain the community. The specific arrangements might continue to evolve. Indeed, they probably would. But the fundamental reality of agricultural life would continue. One spring morning, nearly 40 years after the plague, William walked out to the common fields as he'd done thousands of times before. The morning was bright and cool, and the soil was ready for plowing. His sons and grandsons were already there, preparing the oxen and the plows. He stood for a moment looking at the fields that had defined his life. So much had changed since that morning in 1350 when he'd counted only 7 other men, where there should have been 30. The village had recovered, though never to its pre-plague population. The social order had been transformed. The relationship between lords and laborers had been fundamentally renegotiated. But the fields remained, and the work remained, and the community remained. They'd adapted, survived, built new ways of living from the ruins of the old, and they would continue to adapt as circumstances changed, as they always had, as humans always do. William picked up a handful of soil, crumbling it between his fingers as he'd done so many times before. Good earth, dark and fertile, holding the accumulated labor of generations and promising future harvests. This was the continuity that mattered, not specific customs or social arrangements, but the land itself and the people committed to working it. He thought about his father, dead these 40 years, and his mother, recently departed, and all the others who died in the plague or in the years since. They'd left him this, the land, the knowledge, the community, and he would leave it to his children, transformed but continuous, adapted but enduring. The sun rose higher, warming the morning, and William joined his sons and grandsons in the day's work. There was ploughing to be done and planting and all the endless tasks that agricultural life required. The work was hard, as it had always been, as it would always be, but it was meaningful work, work that connected him to the land and to the community and to the long chain of generations stretching backward into the past and forward into the future. Life in the common fields continued as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more. The plague had been a catastrophe, a rupture in the fabric of normal life, a disaster that killed millions and transformed societies. But life had continued. People had adapted, found new ways to farm and organize and live together. The fields had been planted and harvested again and again, season after season, creating the food that sustained life and the rhythms that gave it meaning. And in villages across England, across Europe, across all the plague-affected regions, similar stories were unfolding. Survivors learning to farm with reduced labor forces, communities negotiating new social arrangements, people adapting to changed circumstances and building new lives from the fragments of old ones. The plague had changed everything, but farming continued because farming had to continue, because people had to eat, because life insisted on going forward even after the worst disasters. And in that continuation, in that stubborn persistence of agricultural life, despite catastrophe, there was a kind of hope, a demonstration that humans can survive, can adapt, can create new worlds even after old worlds end. William worked through the morning, guiding a plow, feeling the familiar resistance of the soil, watching the straight furrow extend behind him. His hands were gnarled with age and work, but they still knew what to do. His back ached, but it still held him upright. His mind held decades of accumulated knowledge about these specific fields, this specific soil, these specific strips of land that had been worked by coopers for longer than anyone could remember. This was his legacy, his contribution to the long chain, keeping the fields productive, passing on the knowledge, maintaining the community. Not as it had been, because that was impossible, but as it could be, adapted and transformed, but still essentially itself. The common fields of Ashbrook would be farmed for centuries more, through further social changes and agricultural revolutions, through enclosures and mechanization and all the transformations to come. And farmers in future generations, working these same lands with methods and technologies William couldn't imagine, would still be connected to him and his generation, still building on the adaptations made in the aftermath of the plague, still working soil that held the labor of countless generations. In the spring of 1390, an old man named William Cooper put his hands in soil his grandfather had worked, and he planted seeds that his grandchildren would harvest, and life continued in the common fields as it had always continued, through plague and disaster and ordinary days, through catastrophe and recovery and the slow, patient work of growing food from the earth, one season at a time, one generation after another, enduring,